In 1987, a cargo loader at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport executed what federal investigators would later call one of the most methodical inside thefts in aviation history. $3.3 million in cash vanished in broad daylight, loaded onto trucks that rolled past security checkpoints without raising a single alarm. No masks, no weapons, no dramatic chase scenes. Just a man in a standard uniform who knew exactly when, where, and how to make a fortune disappear. The case went cold within months. No arrests, no recovered money, no credible leads. The FBI closed the file in 1992, marking it as an exceptional loss with no viable suspects. But in 2015, during the demolition of an abandoned freight warehouse on Chicago's South Side, a construction crew discovered something that would crack open a mystery that had stayed buried for nearly 3 decades. A single photograph, tucked inside a forgotten maintenance log, showed the exact route the stolen money had taken. And standing in that photograph, clear as day, was the man who had made it all possible. What started as a routine job became something far more complex to unravel. Isaiah Legend had spent his entire adult life working cargo operations at one of the busiest airports in the world. He understood schedules, security rotations, and the precise timing of high-value shipments. Most importantly, he understood how to move through the system without being noticed. On the morning of September 14, 1987, all of that knowledge came together in a plan that would take federal agents 28 years to fully comprehend. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Isaiah Legend had been employed by Midwest Cargo Services for over 12 years when opportunity finally presented itself. At 41 years old, he was considered one of the most reliable workers in his division, known for arriving early, staying late, and handling sensitive shipments with meticulous care. His supervisors trusted him with high-priority loads, and his colleagues respected his quiet professionalism. No one suspected that behind this facade of dependability, Legend was carefully studying every aspect of the operation, mapping vulnerabilities, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The target wasn't chosen randomly. Federal Reserve transfers moved through O'Hare on a predictable schedule, typically arriving on Tuesday and Thursday mornings aboard specially designated flights from regional banking centers. These shipments contained worn currency being transported for destruction, new bills being distributed to local banks, and occasionally large cash deposits from major corporations. Legend had observed these transfers for months, noting that security protocols varied depending on the size of the shipment and the specific airline handling the cargo. On September 14th, a United Airlines cargo flight arrived from Denver, carrying 3 sealed containers marked for immediate transfer to a waiting armored truck. The shipment contained $3.3 million in mixed denominations, primarily $20 and $50 bills that had been collected from Colorado banking institutions. Legend knew this shipment was coming because he had access to the cargo manifest 3 days in advance. He also knew that the armored truck wouldn't arrive for another 45 minutes due to a scheduling conflict with another pickup across the city. The operation began at 7:23 a.m. when Legend clocked in for his regular shift. He worked alone in Section C of the cargo facility, an area designated for high-security transfers that required special clearance badges. His supervisor, Marcus Williams, was attending a safety meeting in the main terminal, leaving Legend unsupervised for approximately 1 hour. This timing wasn't coincidental. Legend had been tracking Williams' schedule for weeks, identifying windows when he would be working without direct oversight. Legend approached the 3 containers with a standard hydraulic dolly, the same equipment he used for legitimate transfers dozens of times each week. The containers were locked with federal seals, but Legend had prepared for this obstacle months earlier. Through a contact who worked in shipping supplies, he had obtained blank federal seal tags that were identical to the ones used on legitimate shipments. His plan wasn't to break the seals, but to replace them with fakes that would pass casual inspection. Working quickly but methodically, Legend used a small cutting tool to remove the original seals from each container. He photographed the serial numbers with a disposable camera, then applied the fake seals he had prepared in advance. The entire process took less than 8 minutes. To any observer, the containers would appear completely secure and untampered with. Next came the critical phase of the operation. Instead of loading the containers onto the dolly for transport to the armored truck pickup area, Legend moved them to Loading Bay 7, a service entrance typically used for oversized freight that couldn't fit through the main cargo doors. This bay provided direct access to the external loading dock, where Legend had positioned a rented panel truck the night before. The truck had been leased under the name of a legitimate shipping company that frequently conducted business at O'Hare. Legend had researched the company's scheduling patterns and determined that they had no deliveries planned for that morning. By using their name and matching the vehicle's appearance to their standard fleet, he created a plausible cover story for the truck's presence at the airport. Legend had rehearsed the loading procedure multiple times using empty containers of similar size and weight. He knew exactly how long it would take to move the 3 containers from the cargo bay into the truck, and he had calculated the optimal route to avoid security cameras and high traffic areas. The entire transfer took 14 minutes, completed without assistance and without attracting attention from other workers or security personnel. Once the containers were secured in the truck, Legend returned to his normal duties, continuing his shift as if nothing unusual had occurred. He processed several routine cargo transfers, updated his paperwork, and maintained his typical professional demeanor. When Marcus Williams returned from his meeting, he found Legend working on a shipment of automotive parts, completely absorbed in his standard responsibilities. The theft wasn't discovered until 10:15 a.m. when the armored truck crew arrived for the scheduled pickup. They found the 3 containers in the designated pickup area, properly sealed and apparently untouched. It wasn't until they reached the Federal Reserve facility and the seals were removed that the theft was revealed. The containers were empty, except for packing material and a few scattered bills that Legend had left behind to maintain the appearance of normal cargo weight. By the time federal agents arrived at O'Hare to begin their investigation, Legend had already completed his shift and departed the airport. The rented truck had been returned to the leasing company with no unusual documentation or damage reports. The fake seals had been disposed of, and the original seals had been destroyed. Legend had covered his tracks with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him such a trusted employee. The initial investigation focused on external security breaches, organized crime connections, and possible corruption within the armored truck company. Federal agents interviewed hundreds of airport employees, reviewed months of security footage, and conducted background checks on anyone with access to high-value cargo areas. Legend was questioned twice as part of the routine employee interviews, but his clean record, cooperative attitude, and solid alibi made him appear to be just another reliable witness rather than a potential suspect. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that Legend had been planning this operation for over 2 years, carefully studying every aspect of the cargo system and identifying the precise combination of timing, access, and misdirection needed to pull off such an ambitious theft. The money was already moving through a laundering network he had established months earlier, filtered through legitimate businesses, and converted into assets that would never be traced back to the original crime. The case file grew thick with dead ends and false leads. Federal agents pursued connections to known criminal organizations, investigated potential insider networks, and analyzed financial records of airport employees looking for suspicious activity. But Isaiah Legend remained invisible, hidden in plain sight among hundreds of cargo workers who had access to the same facilities and information. For the next 18 months, Legend continued working at O'Hare as if nothing had changed. He maintained his perfect attendance record, volunteered for overtime shifts, and even received a commendation for his handling of a damaged shipment that could have resulted in significant losses for the airline. To his colleagues and supervisors, he remained the same dependable employee who had earned their trust over more than a decade of service. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, Legend was executing the second phase of his plan. The $3.3 million hadn't simply vanished into thin air. It had been systematically processed through a network of shell companies and legitimate businesses that Legend had spent years establishing. Working with two carefully chosen partners, he had created a complex web of financial transactions designed to transform the stolen cash into clean, untraceable assets. The first partner was Damon Reeves, a former accountant who had been quietly operating a document forgery service out of a small office in downtown Chicago. Reeves specialized in creating false business records, fabricated invoices, and phantom transactions that could justify large cash deposits without triggering federal reporting requirements. He had been working with Legend since 1985, initially helping him establish fake companies that existed only on paper but appeared legitimate to banking institutions and government agencies. The second partner was Angela Washington, who owned a chain of laundromats and small retail stores across Chicago's South Side. Washington's businesses were perfect for laundering large amounts of cash because they dealt primarily with small denominations and had legitimate reasons for handling significant daily cash flows. Over the course of several months, portions of the stolen money were fed through her operations as inflated daily receipts, creating a paper trail that showed the money as legitimate business income. Legend's role in this network was to provide the initial capital and to serve as a silent partner in various business ventures. He invested portions of the money in real estate purchases, always using intermediaries and shell companies to obscure his involvement. A warehouse on the South Side was purchased through a company called Midwest Industrial Holdings, which existed only as a post office box and a set of incorporation documents filed by Reeves. This warehouse would become the central hub for Legend's operation. Located in an industrial area with minimal foot traffic and no residential neighbors, it provided the perfect location for storing and processing the remaining cash. Legend had the building modified with additional security features, including reinforced doors, motion sensors, and a sophisticated alarm system. To outside observers, it appeared to be a legitimate storage facility for various small businesses in the area. The money was divided into different categories based on how it would be processed. Smaller bills were fed through Washington's retail operations over an extended period, mixed with legitimate business income, and deposited in multiple bank accounts across the city. Larger denominations were converted through underground currency exchanges, traded for gold and silver that could be sold through precious metals dealers without extensive documentation. Legend also invested heavily in legitimate businesses that had strong growth potential. He became a silent partner in a construction company, a restaurant chain, and several retail establishments. These investments were structured through the same shell companies that Reeves had created, ensuring that Legend's name never appeared on any official documents. The profits from these businesses would eventually provide him with a legitimate source of income that could explain his improved financial situation. The beauty of the operation was its patience. Rather than attempting to spend or invest the money quickly, Legend allowed the laundering process to unfold over several years. Small amounts were processed regularly, creating a steady stream of clean income that appeared to come from various legitimate sources. The bulk of the money remained in secure storage, waiting for the right opportunities to be introduced into the financial system without attracting attention. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into the airport theft continued to pursue false leads and dead ends. Agents had identified several potential suspects among airport employees who had gambling debts, financial problems, or connections to known criminal organizations. They conducted surveillance operations, wiretapped phone calls, and offered substantial rewards for information leading to arrests. But none of these efforts came close to identifying the real perpetrator. Legend watched the investigation unfold with careful attention, noting which areas the agents were focusing on and adjusting his behavior accordingly. He avoided any activities that might draw attention to himself, maintained his modest lifestyle, and continued to work at the airport with the same dedication he had shown for years. His only concession to his newfound wealth was the gradual improvement of his living situation, moving from a small apartment to a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. The purchase of the house was handled through one of his shell companies, with the down payment explained as proceeds from the sale of inherited property in another state. Legend had Reeves create a complete backstory for this fictional inheritance, including forged death certificates, property deeds, and estate settlement documents. The house was furnished modestly, with no obvious signs of sudden wealth that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors or authorities. By 1990, Legend had successfully processed approximately 60% of the stolen money through his laundering network. The remaining cash was stored in the warehouse, divided into multiple hiding places and secured with various protection measures. He had created detailed inventory records, tracking exactly how much money had been processed through each channel and how much remained to be laundered. The operation might have continued indefinitely, with the money gradually disappearing into legitimate investments and business ventures. But Legend made one critical error that would eventually expose the entire scheme. In his meticulous documentation of the warehouse operation, he had kept photographic records of the money storage systems, the security modifications, and the various routes used to transport cash to and from the building. These photographs were stored in a maintenance log that Legend kept in his office at the warehouse. The log was intended to track repairs, security updates, and other operational details that might be needed for insurance purposes or business planning. But among these routine maintenance records was a single photograph that clearly showed Legend himself, standing next to stacks of cash that were being prepared for processing through Washington's retail operations. The photograph was taken in late 1989, during a period when Legend was reorganizing the storage system to accommodate a large batch of money that was ready for laundering. He had asked Reeves to document the new arrangement for security purposes, ensuring that they would have a record of how the money was organized and protected. Neither man realized at the time that this single image would eventually become the key evidence that would unravel their entire operation. For 25 years, this photograph remained hidden in the maintenance log, stored in a filing cabinet in the warehouse office. Legend had long since moved the remaining money to other locations, and the warehouse had been converted to legitimate storage use for various small businesses. The building changed hands several times, eventually falling into disrepair as the industrial area declined and businesses moved to more modern facilities. In 2015, the warehouse was finally sold to a development company that planned to demolish it and construct a new commercial complex. During the demolition process, construction workers discovered the old maintenance records in a water-damaged filing cabinet that had been left behind by previous tenants. Most of the documents were illegible, destroyed by years of moisture and neglect. But the photograph survived, protected by a plastic sleeve that had kept it relatively intact despite the harsh conditions. When the construction foreman found it among the debris, he initially assumed it was just an old business photo from one of the warehouse's previous tenants. The image showed a man in work clothes standing in what appeared to be a storage area, with several boxes and containers visible in the background. What caught the foreman's attention wasn't the man in the photograph, but rather what appeared to be stacks of currency visible in the background. The boxes and containers that initially seemed like ordinary warehouse inventory revealed themselves under closer inspection to be something far more significant. Bundles of cash were clearly visible, arranged in organized stacks that suggested systematic storage rather than casual handling. The foreman contacted the demolition company's main office, unsure whether he was looking at evidence of criminal activity or simply an old photograph from a legitimate cash-handling business. The company's legal department advised him to turn the photograph over to local police, who forwarded it to the FBI's Chicago field office as a matter of routine procedure. Agent Patricia Hendricks had been with the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit for 8 years when the photograph landed on her desk in March 2015. She specialized in cold case investigations involving large-scale theft and money laundering operations, and something about the image immediately caught her attention. The organized arrangement of the cash, the industrial setting, and the time period suggested by the photograph's quality all pointed to a sophisticated operation rather than ordinary criminal activity. Hendricks began by researching the warehouse's history, tracing its ownership and tenant records back through several decades. The building had housed dozens of different businesses over the years, from auto parts distributors to furniture storage operations. But none of the legitimate tenants she identified had any reason to be handling large amounts of cash in the manner shown in the photograph. The breakthrough came when Hendricks cross-referenced the warehouse's location with a database of unsolved financial crimes from the 1980s and early 1990s. The proximity to O'Hare International Airport immediately brought up several cases, including the 1987 cargo theft that had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. The timing was right, the location was strategic, and the amount of cash visible in the photograph was consistent with a major theft operation. Hendricks retrieved the original case file from the Bureau's archives, reviewing hundreds of pages of investigation reports, witness interviews, and evidence documentation. The case had been exhaustively investigated at the time, with agents pursuing every possible lead and interviewing hundreds of airport employees. But the photograph represented a completely new piece of evidence that had never been part of the original investigation. The challenge was identifying the man in the photograph. The image quality was good enough to show his general appearance and build, but facial recognition technology in 2015 wasn't sophisticated enough to process a photograph that was over 25 years old. Hendricks would need to use traditional investigative methods, comparing the image to employee records and identification photographs from the original case file. She began with a list of airport employees who had been interviewed during the initial investigation, focusing on those who had access to high-security cargo areas and who matched the general physical description of the man in the photograph. Isaiah Legend's name appeared in the case file as one of several hundred employees who had been questioned, but he had never been considered a serious suspect due to his clean record and cooperative attitude during the interviews. When Hendricks compared Legend's 1987 employee identification photograph to the man in the warehouse image, the resemblance was striking. The facial structure, body type, and general appearance were consistent, allowing for the passage of time between the two photographs. But resemblance alone wouldn't be enough to reopen a federal case that had been closed for over 20 years. Hendricks needed to establish a connection between Legend and the warehouse where the photograph had been discovered. Property records showed that the building had been purchased in 1988 by Midwest Industrial Holdings, a company that existed only as a post office box and a set of incorporation documents. The timing of this purchase, just months after the airport theft, was suspicious enough to warrant deeper investigation. Corporate records for Midwest Industrial Holdings revealed a complex web of shell companies and intermediary businesses that had been used to obscure the true ownership of the warehouse. The paperwork had been expertly crafted, with legitimate-looking business licenses, tax filings, and insurance policies that created the appearance of a functioning commercial enterprise. But when Hendricks attempted to trace the actual business activities of these companies, she found no evidence of legitimate operations. The investigation revealed that the incorporation documents for Midwest Industrial Holdings had been filed by a Chicago attorney named Damon Reeves, who specialized in business formation and document preparation. When Hendricks contacted Reeves' office, she discovered that he had died in 2003, and his practice had been dissolved. His former secretary, now retired, remembered him handling numerous corporate filings for clients who paid in cash and preferred to remain anonymous. This discovery led Hendricks to examine other shell companies that had been incorporated by Reeves during the same time period. The pattern was clear. Multiple businesses had been created using similar structures and documentation, all designed to facilitate the movement of money without creating traceable connections to the actual owners. Many of these companies had purchased real estate, invested in legitimate businesses, or conducted financial transactions that appeared normal on the surface but served to launder illegally obtained funds. One of these shell companies, Chicago Retail Ventures, had been used to acquire partial ownership stakes in several laundromats and small retail stores throughout the South Side. The businesses were owned by Angela Washington, an entrepreneur who had built a successful chain of service-oriented establishments in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. Washington's businesses had shown remarkable growth during the late 1980s and early 1990s, with cash flows that seemed disproportionate to their size and customer base. When Hendricks interviewed Washington in 2015, she found a woman in her 70s who had retired from active business management but still maintained ownership of several properties. Washington was initially cooperative, providing business records and financial documentation from the relevant time period. But when Hendricks began asking specific questions about the cash-intensive nature of her operations during the late 1980s, Washington became evasive and eventually refused to continue the interview without legal representation. The financial records that Washington had provided painted a picture of businesses that had experienced sudden and sustained increases in cash revenue beginning in late 1987. The increases were consistent across multiple locations and continued for several years before gradually returning to more typical levels. The pattern suggested that large amounts of additional cash had been systematically fed through the businesses, mixed with legitimate revenue, and deposited in various bank accounts. Hendricks obtained court orders to examine the banking records associated with Washington's businesses during the relevant time period. The deposits showed a clear pattern of cash-heavy transactions that were structured to avoid federal reporting requirements. Individual deposits were kept below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reports to financial intelligence agencies, but the cumulative amounts were substantial enough to process hundreds of thousands of dollars over several months. The money laundering operation had been sophisticated and patient, spreading the stolen cash across multiple businesses and bank accounts to avoid detection. But the systematic nature of the deposits created a pattern that was visible when examined comprehensively. The timing of the increased cash flows, beginning just months after the airport theft, provided circumstantial evidence linking Washington's businesses to the stolen money. Meanwhile, Hendricks continued investigating Isaiah Legend's activities during the years following the theft. Financial records showed that his lifestyle had improved gradually but noticeably after 1987. He had moved from a modest apartment to a middle-class house, purchased through another shell company that could be traced back to Damon Reeves's legal practice. The down payment had been explained as proceeds from the sale of inherited property, but when Hendricks attempted to verify this inheritance, she found that the supporting documentation was fraudulent. Legend had left his job at O'Hare in 1994, citing health concerns that made it difficult for him to continue the physical demands of cargo handling. He had received a modest pension and disability settlement, which appeared to be his primary source of income in the years that followed. but property records and tax filings suggested that his actual financial resources were significantly greater than what could be explained by his legitimate earnings. In 1998, Legend had invested in a small construction company that specialized in residential renovation projects. The investment had been made through yet another shell company, and Legend's name appeared nowhere in the official business documentation. But surveillance of the company's operations revealed that Legend visited the offices regularly and appeared to have significant input into business decisions. The construction company had been consistently profitable, providing returns that would have generated substantial income for its silent partner. The web of financial connections was complex but traceable. Money from the airport theft had been laundered through Washington's retail operations, invested in various business ventures, and used to purchase real estate and other assets. The profits from these legitimate investments had then provided a steady stream of clean income that allowed Legend to maintain a comfortable lifestyle without raising suspicion about the source of his wealth. But the photograph from the warehouse represented direct evidence of Legend's involvement in handling large amounts of cash during the critical time period immediately following the theft. The image showed him in a setting that was clearly designed for storing and organizing currency, engaged in activities that had no legitimate explanation given his known sources of income at the time. Hendricks presented her findings to federal prosecutors, who agreed that the accumulated evidence was sufficient to seek indictments against Legend and Washington for money laundering and conspiracy charges related to the 1987 theft. While the statute of limitations had expired for the original theft itself, the ongoing nature of the money laundering operation meant that some charges could still be prosecuted. The indictments were unsealed in September 2015, nearly 28 years after the original crime. Legend was arrested at his home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where neighbors described him as a friendly but private man who kept to himself and maintained his property meticulously. The arrest came as a complete shock to the community, where Legend had lived for over 15 years without incident. Washington was arrested the same day at one of her laundromats, where she still worked part-time despite her advanced age. Her arrest created significant controversy in the South Side community, where she was known as a successful businesswoman who had provided employment opportunities and supported local economic development for decades. Many of her longtime customers and employees refused to believe that she could have been involved in criminal activity. The arrests marked the end of one of the most patient and methodical criminal operations in Chicago's history. For nearly 3 decades, Legend had successfully concealed his involvement in one of the largest airport thefts ever recorded, using a combination of careful planning, systematic money laundering, and meticulous operational security to avoid detection. But a single photograph, preserved by chance in an abandoned warehouse, had finally provided federal investigators with the evidence they needed to unravel the entire scheme. The image captured a moment in time when Legend believed he was completely safe from discovery, documenting his role in an operation that he thought would remain hidden forever. The case demonstrated how even the most carefully planned crimes could be exposed by unexpected evidence that surfaces years or decades after the fact. Legend's downfall came not from any mistake in his original execution of the theft, but from his decision to document the money laundering operation that followed. The photograph that seemed like a simple business record at the time ultimately became the key that unlocked a mystery that had puzzled federal investigators for nearly 30 years. The case that began with 3 empty containers at O'Hare Airport finally closed in a federal courtroom 28 years later. Isaiah Legend was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for money laundering and conspiracy charges. Angela Washington received 8 years for her role in the operation. The $3.3 million was never fully recovered, but federal agents estimated that over $2 million had been successfully laundered through their network. Sometimes, the smallest oversight can bring down the most carefully constructed schemes. and sometimes that oversight takes nearly 3 decades to surface.